afternoon and Assalamu alaikum, welcome ladies and gentlemen. Now the lecture this afternoon, in fact, is going to be a bit special from the rest of the series this term. This is, you have to imagine that we are in Michaelmas term, suddenly right in the middle of summer. Because this lecture, in fact, this afternoon forms part of a series I'm convening indeed in collaboration with my colleague last term, Dr. Adela, from Chicago University. Of course, he's the director for the Islamic Medicine Unit there in Chicago. And we are indeed fortunate to have the support from the Templeton Foundation for our wider project called Conversations on Islam and the Human Sciences. So just to recap, this series attempts to address this gap by encouraging scholarly conversations bridging traditional Islamic theology, metaphysics, and the latest issues arising out of the scientific field of biomedicine. And more specifically for our wider project supported by Templeton, we will be engaging with the question of integration. How might scientific knowledge inform and work with the various Muslim theologies on the nature of being and life? So we're very fortunate today. In fact, we have Dr. Rafaqat Rashid, who is from the Al-Balah Academy, and Dr. Rashid is both a traditional Muslim scholar and a GP. He is the course director of the Al-Balah Academy and a lecturer at the JKN Institute. And these are both Muslim educational institutions, seminaries if you like, pretty much, madrasas based in the north. And it chimes in with the attempts that we want to do with regards to our project of engaging Muslim traditional Muslim scholars in conversation with doctors and scientists as well. So he occasionally lectures also at the University of Leeds, and he writes columns including the one called Ask a Muslim Doctor and Living in Islam in Modern Times in the Al-Mu'min magazine. So in addition to his medical practice and his teaching, Dr. Rashid conducts research in Islamic medical ethics and medical law and has a particular research interest in the ethics of organ transplantation, immunizations, family planning, and end-of-life decisions. Today, Dr. Rashid will speak on the intersection between science, philosophy, and Islamic theological and legal discourse in medically defining death. So ladies and gentlemen, let us all give a very warm Southern Oxford welcome to our scholar from the north.
Thank you for that introduction. And I would like to thank you also for inviting me here. It's the first time I've been to this centre, and I'm quite fascinated by the centre. It's very nice, and hopefully the last time I'll be here.
Yeah, certainly not. Sure.
Okay, right. So my subject actually entails a number of different sciences. So generally, when this kind of subject is discussed, defining death, especially from an Islamic theological perspective, there seems to be a lot of focus on normative ethics, which in Islam tends to be mainly around the sciences of Islamic law and fiqh. What I'm trying to do is intersect this whole idea of what's currently out there in some of these fatwa organizations around the world and bring this together with the science of philosophy, with science, and also with kalam, so ilm al-kalam, which is to do with theology. So the general layout of the agenda will be such that there will be a very basic sort of grasp of history of determining death, so that we need to understand the background and the historical context to death. Then going on to investigating what human death actually is. So within that domain, there will be two particular focal areas. One will be about what is death. So within that, we'll be talking about the organistic concept of death, and also the brain being a prime integrator. Now this will be done solely from the angle from an Islamic theological perspective. Then there will be something about how to determine death. So that's more an epistemological sort of a framework around the whole subject. And then we'll finish off if we get time with the conclusion. So currently, we have certain statements in terms of the historical context from the Western world specifically about defining death. And you'll see here that there has been some kind of statement in terms of a journey that we've been going through in terms of highlighting exactly what death means from a practical means, specifically aimed at medical professionals. So on that basis, you'll see the ad hoc committee of Harvard Medical School defined death as irreversible coma. And that gradually became more detailed, and because of life-saving therapies and withdrawal life support and various other things, this idea developed and needed more detail. And as a result of that, UK sort of stood forth and defined death on the basis of the brain stem death. And then the USA, with cessation of function of entire brain, related it to two different things. One was about the irreversible cessation of circular respiratory function, and the second was about irreversible cessation of all functions of the entire brain, including the brain stem. So it's a very interesting subject, and after going through this, the level of depth you can go into this topic is quite immense. But these are some of the Muslim religious body statements regarding death, and you'll see here there are certain highlights of this particular journey, even amongst Muslim scholars. So there is initially a rejection of the Western understanding of medical death, where a person cannot be considered dead when his brain has died. And then this sort of developed later on. And notice it's roughly around the same period, probably about 5 to 10 years after the Western sort of statements were made from the Harvard University and so forth. But generally speaking, you can see here that there's some statement regarding that once a human being is ascertained to have reached the stage of brain death, that person is considered to have withdrawn from life. And then it moves on to the idea of Islamic legal rules for the dead becoming applicable under the following criteria, which is very similar to the criteria which was stipulated by the USA, which is basically talks about somebody who suffers from cardiorespiratory arrest, and also makes reference to brain activity which has ceased, and hence the physician confirmed that such a cessation is irreversible. And then finally we have the end, a patient with no brain activity or with irreversible damage, which falls in line again with the USA sort of understanding of death. So already you can see there are a number of bodies out there who have clearly aligned their verdict in line with some of the Western concepts of defining death. However, having said that, some very important points to pull from this. There's a lot of literature around this, but generally speaking, it highlights something that Dr. Wichtick's pointed out in 2002, which was that despite national guidelines and doubts and misconceptions about the concept of brain death, death may still prevail with the whole idea that this is not completely accepted by the public. And within the actual indefinite fatwas that are out there, the sort of verdicts that are out there related to death, there seems to be a lot of conflict in some of the definitions, and a lot of diversity in those definitions, which is causing a lot of confusion as well. So, as a result of this, the first thing that is worthwhile looking into is going back historically and looking at what the Muslim Jurists stated regarding some of the physical signs of death. So a historical context of this sort of identifies a couple of things. The first thing is the Quran itself is not explicit about the physical signs of death. So as a result of this, this is fallen on the remit of ijtihad. So it's about reasoning, sort of scholarly reasoning, in terms of how they can come up with a solution to look at this particular area. So if you go back, quite back in history, right up to probably the last sort of 200 years even, or even less than that, you'll find that this has always been a phenomenon that's always existed in some of the books of Islamic law. And it's described the physical signs of death as being something related to the cessation of breathing, limpness of feet, looseness of wrists, bending of nose, sunken temples, and various other. There's a whole list of different physical signs that are being used, and some of the references I've used there are some of the most prominent books of fiqh that some of the Muslim muftis use today. So the main thing here is that there is no mention of absence of heartbeat or cardiopulmonary death, which is considered the traditional death. And yet these were some of the signs that were used by individuals, or were they? I mean, that's the real question we need to ask. So the interesting thing is that there was some realism in this, and there were many sort of jurists who recognized that some of these physical signs are not conclusive or definitive in diagnosing death. So on the basis of this, you'll find there are a number of classical jurists who point out a number of very interesting points, and some of the things that they mention, like for example Ibn Qudama, is that he talks about the fact that these physical signs of death could, in essence, if they're related to dying suddenly, like as a result of shock or fight or a battle or preying animal, that they are quite uncertain. So he clearly outlines the uncertainty in some of these physical signs. Hassan Basri does the same. He says that we should really, ideally, if we are on shore, wait for 3 days. And note how they've given an arbitrary sort of number of days in which we should wait. And Imam Nawawi talks about it in terms of the fact 1, 2, or 3 days. Ibn Rushd does the same. And Ibn Abidin, who's somebody who was around the sort of 18th century Damascene scholar, somebody from Damascus, who was a quite recognized jurist. In fact, one of his books that he's actually written is used today amongst the Hanafi muftis, Rasm al-Mufti. So his statements do carry quite a bit of weight. It's interesting what he says. Many of those who have been determined dead due to their motionless are buried alive because it is difficult to determine conclusive death except with best medical experts. So it's an interesting, quite discomforting thing to hear, that we could be burying people alive. So already you can identify and recognize the uncertainty that exists in defining death. Now I'm just going to really briefly highlight an epistemological angle to this, and what that really is in line with is how we look at the legal certainty, so from the Shari perspective. And here we talk about death, generally speaking, on general 4 different levels. So we have what we call yaqeen, we have what we call predominant conjecture, which is ghalabat al-dhann. We have what we call doubt, shock, and elusive, something which is wahm. And in a kind of a way to highlight this in terms of figures as a percentage, in terms of certainty, which again is quite arbitrary in itself. If you go to Al-Mabsut, which is a book of fiqh written by Imam Saratsi, who was a Hanafi scholar, he highlights, and this is also supported by some of the other sort of Muslim jurists, that the definition of shak here as doubt would be when the level of knowledge and ignorance about roughly the same. So it's 50-50 on either end. So as a result of this, you can already see the percentages lying in those particular areas. So when it comes to yaqeen, the word yaqeen and the word ghalabat al-dhann are used quite interchangeably, and they always have been. And I was reading an article very recently about how they can be very confusing, because sometimes when Muslim jurists talk about yaqeen, certainty, which you take as a literal context, what they actually mean is what's practically possible, so from a pragmatic point of view. And reality is that it actually falls on ghalabat al-dhann. It falls on the idea of predominant conjecture. So the idea is when you leave somebody for 2 to 3 days because you're not sure that they died, what you're doing is you're not 100% sure, you can never be 100% sure, but rather you reach a level of ghalabat al-dhann, a predominant conjecture, and that will give you some kind of indication that from an Islamic law perspective that it would be okay for you now to bury this individual. So on that basis, this article was written by Alexander, it's a fantastic piece of work, and he actually went through this whole historically, looked at the idea of defining death from a Western perspective as well, even right up to the 18th century. And he highlights some very interesting things, and he talks about any claim that death was simple and irreversible before the development of a life-sustaining technology is actually quite suspect. Death has always been difficult and quite confusing. And he also talks about that never has been any medical consensus about the signs of death. And many physicians believe that putrefaction, which in essence reality is, even when you look at those physical signs that I mentioned earlier on, which are in some of those books of fiqh, you'll find that those are signs when somebody is putrefying. So clearly they've gone through a phase of rigor mortis, and so it's a very late stage when the person has clearly died. But have they? The reality is not necessarily, because he highlights that you can end up having gangrene in different parts of your body. So it may seem that somebody is putrefying, but the reality is that they're still alive. So you can already see the complexity there in terms of defining death, or even looking at physical signs that will give some kind of indication that somebody has died. I can see the fright on your faces. So Investigation of human death. Okay, so what two things do we need to really focus on? The first is that we need to look at what is human death. Okay, and the second is how can we determine that it has occurred? So when we're looking at the concept of human death, the ontological or conceptual, so we need some kind of idea of a definition, in other words. And that definition would exist on the framework of something along the lines of irreversible cessation of organismic function, something along those lines. And when it comes to determining that it has occurred, it may be something along the lines of a whole brain death standard. So a criteria is basically set. So these are the two main functional areas that we'll be looking at. So what is human death? So let's focus on the first. Here you'll see that there have been three main fundamental concepts related to somebody who has died. So they are basically traditional. And the traditional, in essence, refers to the irreversible loss of vital fluid flow. And also the criteria for this is cessation of heart and lungs. So clearly when somebody is not perfused anymore, there is no blood, and the person is not breathing, then we would assume that the person has died. So that's related to apnea, which is loss of breath, and absence of pulse. Then we have our whole brain death, brainstem sort of understanding of definition. This is to do with irreversible loss of the integrating capacity. We'll be focusing on this particular area quite considerably in the next sort of 20-30 minutes. And that's to do with the cessation of the whole brain. Okay? And this is the Harvard criteria. And then we have the higher brain death, which is an interesting new phenomenon that's come out, and it has always been discussed, but it's becoming very, very prominent. The philosophers are really pushing this particular agenda. So it will be interesting to see the Islamic stance to the idea of higher brain death. So this is to do with the irreversible loss of personhood, of consciousness, of cessation of higher brain functioning. And that would basically be tested by the absence of responsiveness of voluntary movements. So the whole brain versus traditional approach. Now, when we look at the idea about whole brain and versus traditional approach, the approach there is to look at all beings, all living things, as organisms. And clearly, if you look at everything as on the basis of organisms, the idea that what we really need to look at and define here is the organismic definition of death. Okay? So that would apply to any organism. It seems like a universal concept, a universal way of defining death, and it seems like the most appropriate thing to do. And that would, if you go down to the detail, what that really means it's about the collapse of the integrated bodily functioning. So, for example, even when you look at something like a leaf, which we consider as something which is living, then clearly what would happen is once the integrated bodily functioning of the leaf has collapsed, that leaf will die. As would a human. So if the integrated bodily functioning of a human dies or collapses, then inevitably that will cascade, and then there will be an irreversible process which will lead to the death of the individual. And the second aspect of this is an emphasis on the brain's role as the primary integrator of overall bodily functioning. So there's something about defining an idea or a concept around the idea about organismic definition of death related to integrated bodily functioning. And there's also something around emphasizing the point that is it the brain which is the primary integrator of overall bodily functioning. So what I'm going to do is go and delve quite deeply into the subject of the Sunni scholastic theology, Ilm al-Kalam, and talk about the idea of collapse of integrated bodily functioning from that particular perspective. So let's go back historically. Let's look at the Sunni schools of thought related to scholastic theology and get some kind of perception about what is it that Muslims considered as the integrated bodily functioning, or some kind of sense about an integrated sense about the body. And also look at the human bodily integration and life-death concept. So how does that relate to life? How does that relate to death? And then finally look at the soul as that integrator. Like we talked about earlier on, the brain being the integrator. Is the soul the integrator for the Muslim classical theologians? So here we talk about a few things, but before I go into that, I just want to highlight there are certain parameters and there is a framework that becomes quite evident when you look at the science of kalam. And that science basically mentions or gives us some kind of indication about a couple of very, very interesting concepts. One is that the philosophies of nature derive specific theological perspectives based on the Quran. So there was a lot of focus on what the Quran was telling us before, and that would basically give us a bit of an idea about how we perceive the nature of the world. And within that, there were internal influential factors and external influencing factors that drove those scholars of theology to then go and pursue this task of reasoning and rationalizing using those particular principles. Some of the internal influencing factors were issues, for example, predestination. The issue of predestination, about the will, about the attributes of God, about issues related to resurrection, and how rationally cogent they were. So there was quite a bit of discussion about that, so we'll make some reference to that. So that was, what that actually did is the number of sects appeared. So you have the Qadariyya, you have the Mu'tazila, and so forth, different kinds of sects appeared with different perceptions or conceptions of these ideas. And there were also external influencing factors, and these external influencing factors were mainly from Jews and from Christians and some other faith groups, also materialists. But the thing with the Jews and the Christians and the materialists was that they were basically armed to the teeth with Greek logic. So they had a great set framework that they were able to present that argument in a quite a standardized form. And as a result of this, there was a need for response from the Muslim theologians, and hence they took the task. So as a result of this, there was a kind of a twofold response. One was about the methodology. Okay, so there was something about rational answers to relationship between revelation, wahi, and also reason, aql. So there was quite a lot of work that was done specifically on actually forming some kind of framework around the idea about reasoning using revelation as the precept. And then there was also something about identifying and formulating authentic criteria of orthodoxy. So this really did play a massive role in actually developing the science of what we call usul al-fiqh or Islamic jurisprudence later on, as well as had an impact on tafsir, on exegesis, and many other subjects. There are two main fundamental things that we need to understand about mainly the Ash'ari, and the reason why I've chosen the Ash'ari, the sort of school of ilm al-kalam, is mainly because they were quite influential. They were considered as the orthodoxy, and even to today, they have quite a lot of influence. And for this reason, primarily, secondly, because they have quite a lot of a rich amount of written work in this particular area. So there are two main fundamental things that are to be recognized when we come to the science of kalam related to the Ash'aris. One is the concept of occasionalism, which is to do with the idea of causation or the nature of causation, which is in essence to do with created substances cannot be efficient causes of events. Instead, all events are taken to be caused directly by God. So God basically directs and creates all actions throughout the whole process consecutively, continually. There are different understandings even today about interactionism, parallelism, which are different forms of causality. But just generally speaking, this was the main fundamental Ash'ari claim to causality, or lack of causality, shall I say. So everything which happens in terms of cause and effect, in essence, is the doing of God. And there was an explanation for the idea of miracles. So Imam Ghazali sort of fundamentally focuses on this idea as well. So then the thing that sort of, as a kind of an offshoot from this, if you are going to accept that everything therefore is created by God, and God continually renews the situation temporally in many time after time in the most minuscule of time quadrants, then you will realize that the idea is the concept of atomism starts arising. And atomism is basically to do with the idea and defined as everything other than God as consisting of two primary types of entities. And one of them is substances, jawr, which is an atom, and the other is accidents. So this is ard. And ard are basically accidents that inhere in atoms and give that atom a property. So a substance is an indivisible space-occupying atom, so juz, that is amenable to receiving accidents. Okay? And this is the fundamental focus of the Ashari basically view of the integration. Very heavy slide, and just goes to show the amount of heaviness that I had to go through to get all this information. But I just want to pull out a couple of themes from this slide, so I don't want to go into too much detail. But you'll see already here, if you look at the Ashari, for example, from this perspective, there was this concept of man. Okay, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I'll just give you the main themes. What this slide demonstrates is that the Asharis, what they were doing, in essence, was using theological concepts and debating with Mu'tazili, who were more rational, sort of oriented Muslims, who had been influenced quite considerably by the Neoplatonic and the Aristotelian sort of domain of knowledge, and as a result of that, responding to them. So they're responding to a dialogue related to issues related to the divine attributes of God and fundamental aspects of their faith. So, interesting enough, man was to be defined as, and this is all to do with the idea that we are obligated individuals. So God has basically introduced us, brought us onto this earth, and we have certain obligations. And that is the concept of taklif. And on that basis, there was a need for them to define what man was. Why are we so special? Why have animals not been given that same kind of obligation? So, on that basic stance, what they did was they looked at man as a form. So, in other words, when somebody would say, what is a man, you'd say, that's a man. And they would point. There you are. So it's a relative thing, a physical. And there's a lot of detail in terms of where that came from, in terms of the language and various other sources. But generally speaking, then there's a response to that. And the response to that was that, but surely, if angels, according to our belief as Muslims, if angels can turn into men, and men can turn into apes and swines, so then this really distorts the idea of that definition, because now they would not be a man. And the response to that was then, so it's to do with the external and the internal form. So it's about the organs internally and so forth. So clearly angels would not have internal organs, just like a man would. So you can already see the kind of level of dialogue that's going on. And it sort of shifts through this journey all the way through. I'll pull out one or two interesting things. Imam al-Baghdadi and al-Ansari, they talk about the idea of death is an accident, directly contrary of life. So they look at death as being an accident, but they don't see life as being an accident. They don't see death as being something just solely on the basis of privation of life, like the Bahshamis did or the philosophers did. So, in other words, when you have no life, you are dead. But rather, it was the idea that death would be an accident. So you would actually be alive. So one part of your body may be alive, and another part of your body may be dead. So on that basis, the interesting thing was that you could look at the idea of hair and bone, for example, as being dead. So some interesting dialogue within that particular framework. But then the main thing to take from this is that this didn't really focus much on this integrated being. So clearly, if God has obligated to do something, so if I was to say to Dr. Al-Afifi, and I'm responding to him as an individual, okay, from the Ashari perspective, I should be referring to you in the plural, because atoms don't engage, don't cause or affect each other. So in other words, you are a general sort of conglomeration of numerous atoms. So I should refer you in the plural. And this was a dialogue that was occurring. And they sort of struggled with that idea because they couldn't fall into the trap of saying that atom had a cause and effect on the other, or influenced the other. So on that basis, because it was all done by God, the whole idea of cause and effect was by God. So on that basis, the idea then stemmed onto a life-saving concept, and that was the concept of the soul. So the Quran stipulates many, many different things about the soul, as are mentioned here on this particular slide. And it relates it to death. But yet, when we look at the whole sort of area around the soul. In the early classic Ash'ari sort of understanding, the soul played a very little role. Their focus was more about the polemics and the dialogue with other groups, and for that reason, the idea of integrity or integration of the body was not considered from the soul perspective. That only came on later on. So if you look at these particular verses of the Quran, they talk about the soul basically leaving at the time of death. Now, there is a clear mystery of the soul, and scholars have already highlighted this mystery. And this particular verse, they ask you about the soul, say the soul is my Lord's concern, little indeed is the knowledge of you are given. This particular verse, what does that actually mean? And Tafsir Qurtubi and Harun, certain books and many other scholars have basically highlighted that there is no implication in this verse that it is prohibited to discuss the soul or research it. Rather, our knowledge will always be limited on the subject. So some scholars say that what is kept from us is the nature and the way it penetrates the body. So in essence, from this we could probably take the idea that we will never get to know how our body interacts with the soul, but we can make many theoretical assumptions. Now, this particular slide highlights a number of different things again, but I'm not going to go into the details again, but generally speaking, you'll see that what I've done there is I've divided up into the traditional scholars, the theological, the kalam, the philosophical, and the mystical, the Sufis. And the main thing to pick up from this particular slide are two main fundamental concepts. One is how the journey has started. So if you look at Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, for example, who is the traditional scholar, and the traditional scholars carry a lot of weight because what they tend to do is they take the literal interpretation of the Quran. And for that reason, there is a kind of a principled framework about taking the literal by default. So as a result of that, they carried a lot of weight historically, and for a number of various other reasons, which goes beyond the scope of what I have to say. But generally speaking, you'll see also the theologians talk about the soul in many, many interesting different ways. But the main theme to pick up from this particular slide is that there were two main fundamental concepts of the soul. One was material and the other was immaterial. So the idea of material was probably the predominant feature initially. And throughout history it has been that the soul is material. Even when you look at, for example, Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, he was trying to reconcile a number of different fundamental things, theological components. And even he described the soul as being material but differs in quiddity in its mahir. So he also describes the idea of a material sort of end to the soul. Then you have individuals like Ibn Sina, who's somebody who had a philosophical background, who talked about the fact that the soul was immaterial. And you also have interesting Al-Iji, who was one of the theologians, who talks about the soul as being completely immaterial substance, perfection of body, as it is nourished, grows, senses. So he talked about it as being immaterial. So there's this presumptive understanding about the soul being either material or immaterial, which we'll talk about later on in more detail. However, having gone through all this, there are some very important fundamental points that we need to understand, that we could do this and present it in the same framework as all these scholars did. But we would have to follow certain important sort of framework points. One is that the need to ensure that divine attributes are maintained and well articulated with an understanding of nature. The other is that to theorize about metaphysical issues of the soul is acceptable and needed to tackle contradiction. So Imam al-Ghazali talks about this idea of contradiction. If there is a contradiction in what we are passing on from a theological perspective, then we need to deal with that, and we need to articulate that in a very rational way. And also the use of sound reasoning is acceptable as long as it's within the guidance of the Quran and Hadith, the prophetic tradition. And the literal meaning is preferred over the default option. And this is an interesting part, because when you look through the whole historical context, if there's anything we've taken from this, is the response and the level of engagement theologians have had with all the different sort of strengths of rationality and sciences of their time. So that suggests that theories can change and develop with internal and external factors such as theology, science and philosophy. Today science plays a very, very important role here. It is a force to be reckoned with. So there's a serious need for Muslims, academics and theologians, to actually start looking at the idea of how they can formulate theories around the idea of how it deals with some of the pertinent issues that science and philosophy bring to the forefront. Now, the purpose of the soul. What is the purpose of the soul? And this is a very important thing to understand, to grasp the whole ontological basis of the soul, and even the metaphysical, and that is to find out what is the purpose of the soul. So the soul, the word soul is an English term, but generally speaking it makes reference to nafs, ruh, and many other words, which I will talk about later on. But generally speaking, you'll see there are three stages that are very clear. One is about before birth, all souls are with God and bear witness to Him, being the Lord. Okay? And the second is to worship God whilst embodied. The third is to reckoning and accountability. So you already see there was a clear purpose in the soul. The soul's purpose was to worship their Lord and also to be accountable. And that was the sole purpose. Its purpose did not fall with a remit anything other than this particular purpose, which is very clearly stipulated through many different verses of the Quran. So when we look at an in-depth analysis of the philosophical as well as the Sufi and the traditional and the psychological, you'll see that the soul has always been referred to not as an entity which relates to the functionality of our human body, but rather in terms of the psychological impact it has on us. So the soul has always been looked at from a psychological perspective, and you see many books, Imam Ghazali, Imam Razi, and many other authors of these books who talk about the soul in this particular manner, rather than from a more functional, materialistic point of view. So the soul is used in many interchangeable sort of wordings, but generally speaking, you'll see here, for example, ar-ruh is the spiritual, and this is sort of collating all this together and making some sense of it. The ruh is the spiritual nature. Okay, so this is the hierarchical nature of the soul. So, for example, if I was to say to Dr. Afifi, you are intelligent, you are somebody who's very generous, that doesn't mean that Dr. Afifi, there's 2 to 3 types of Dr. Afifis, or there are clones of him. But rather what that does is it gives a very clear sense of a number of attributes that we have given to one individual. And similarly, when we talk about the soul in this way, as al-ruh, al-qalb, al-aql, al-nafs, al-jasad is quite different. But when we make reference to the soul, there are certain attributes of the soul, not that there are many different types of souls. So you will have the different interrelationship that exists. So the ruh plays a guiding role, the qalb plays a more academic, sort of intuitive, cognitive role, but more sort of intuition. The aql plays a more intellectual role, and the nafs is more the physiological role. And nafs is a very, very important role because it's the nafs that really needs to spiritually develop. So you will already see that the nafs connects to the body, and the idea of the nafs is to refrain from the bestial attractions, the pleasures of the body, and sort of go more towards the spiritual world.
Basic instincts.
Yes. So you'll see that there's a physical world, which clearly inclines us towards the physical and material things of nature, where we have the spiritual world. So in other words, on that basis, the ruh or the nafs inclines, and there are different types of nafs in that respect, and the idea is for the nafs to develop itself spiritually. Now, when we look at this from that particular perspective, we look at the nafs, you'll see that the nafs can be looked at in a number of different perspectives again, and this is the works of Imam Razi, also Imam Ghazali in his Ma'arij, but they talk about the human insania, or Russian and natiqa. So this is more to do with the main purpose of the soul, like we talked about earlier on. It's about that level of accountability, the subjectivity. These are very, very important components of what the soul should be doing. But when you look at the lower levels, such as the Hawaniya and the Nabatiya, for example, to do with the animalistic and the vegetative, such as nutrition, growth, and reproduction, these are not truly the purpose why the soul is what it is. So clearly they are our attachments to the world, in essence. So what are the implications of soul leaving the body? Now you will see here that there are many scholars who have talked about the soul leaving the body and looked at it from a number of different contexts. But there's a recurring theme throughout all of them. When they talk about the meaning of the soul parting from the body is the separation of the control of its actions from the body. The organs are tools of the soul to be used by it, such as drawing with hands, listening with ears, seeing with eyes, and learning the truth of things by themselves. Death is the failure of all, and all organs are tools used by the soul. So the meaning of death is the separation of actions from the body and departing of the body. Again, you'll see Ibn Qayyim talks about the meaning of parting the soul from the body is the separation of the stimulation of it, or the self, from the body due to the exiting of the body from its control. So it's about the soul controlling these elements. But if we were to now say that you have no control over your arm, your leg, and so forth, then it makes the role of the soul quite redundant. So on that basis, let's say, for example, we were to draw up a table like this, and we were to talk about a number of different sort of scientific or biological components to our body, such as our reflexes, our growth, our reproduction, and nutrition, and compare them with our brainstem and the cerebrum. Cerebrum is basically fundamentally the main part of our brain, which is the cognitive area, the fundamental area of consciousness. And then you have the soul. And it's an interesting pattern that starts arising from this, because we have reflexes, growth, reproduction, nutrition. We recognize the brainstem doesn't actually control them. The brainstem is just a conduit between the functions of the body itself and what the brain, the messages the brain is sending the body. And it's like a track, and if you damage the track, then you lost connection. So on that basis, it doesn't actually control reflexes, growth, reproduction, and nutrition in itself. But if it was damaged, then the soul would lose control over those particular components. The cerebrum, again, is the same thing. It has no control over those areas because the cerebrum has a very different function altogether, and neither does the soul. The soul's role, because those elements, those components, can quite easily be done artificially. So if I was to perfuse you, let's say you're brain dead, and if I was to perfuse you, the reality is, what will end up happening is your body will remain perfused. And there are many cases, there have been instances where women who have been able to deliver babies, yet they've been completely brain dead. So on that basis, these are quite easily artificially instructed. So if you were to say that this was solely the role of the soul, then the reality is that you would be making the soul quite redundant in many different ways. So anyway, going down this list, you'll see there's issues of alertness, awareness, wakefulness, memory, and we'll see already the consistency that exists between the cerebrum, which is our higher brain, and the soul, rather less so with the brainstem. And brainstem is just a kind of a conduct, a conduction process, or a conduit that joins different aspects together. Okay, so the whole brain versus the traditional approach. Let's look at the whole idea again. So we look at the organismic definition of death. We've already realized that that's to do with the departure of the soul. It is the soul which is the integrated, well, basically controls the integrated bodily functioning. So if the soul departs, we die. And now the other thing is about the emphasis on the brain's role as the primary integrator of overall bodily functioning. Now I'm sort of conscious of the time that I have, which is very little.
Okay.
So on that basis, I'll just highlight a couple of things. But generally speaking, you'll see that the brain's role as a primary integrator. So the main thing to understand by the brain is that the life involves integrated functioning of the whole organism. So the brain makes all of these vital functions possible. So even though somebody's got a heartbeat and breathing, they are indicators of life, but they don't constitute life. And that's the important thing. The brainstem standard is very similar to the higher brain standard of the whole brain standard, because you're using the same parameters. I won't go into the detail, but generally speaking, that's what it refers to. I'm just going to give you a very important thought experiment, okay, that's been mentioned in philosophy, and that is in the case of at least some members of our species, total brain failure is not necessary for death. So let's take the idea of a fetus, for example, or a human embryo, early fetus. They don't have a brain because they're very early in their development. So could you say that they have died from the whole brain death definition? Clearly you can't, because they don't have a brain. So similarly, the problem here is that if this makes the idea of death due to departure of the soul, so they don't have a soul either, because a depends on which school of thought you're from, but 40 days or 120 days, they don't have a soul. So on that basis, if they were to die before that period, would you say that they have not died? Because there was no soul in the first place that left them. So if you define it on the basis of soul, then you can see already there's a serious amount of complexity there. But the interesting thing is, there are two ways that you can respond to this. That the fetus is not alive, and hence this is not death. So the thesis of this position is that the human life starts at ensoulment. So the fetus zygote enjoys dignity. So you give it a sense of dignity, ihtiram, okay? And that's the actual position. The fetus is not alive, but is dead. Dead without being alive. And the reason why they say that is because they have dead atoms which have the accident of death. And what happens is when they're ensouled, those atoms now remove the accident of death and they have the accident of life. So for that reason they are considered dead. Now the fetus is alive, and that this is death, but of a different kind of death, which is an interesting concept. So the main thesis of this position is that human life starts at conception, at time of fertilization. And it's interesting, Ibn talks about this. He talks about the idea of qabla nas and ba'da nas, so before and after the soul is breathed into this fetus. And he talks about the idea that qabla nas, before the soul is ensouled, before it's ensouled, is similar to plant and growth and involuntary nourishment. It doesn't have the same moral value as ba'da nas, which is sensations of voluntary moods. Okay? So another thought experiment is about the brain transplant. So on this basis, suppose we develop the ability to transplant brains. Okay, so we can move my brain. Sorry about that, I keep picking on you, to yours. And clearly, Dr. Fifi is he's de-brained. He has no brain. So my brain is moved to his. Okay. So there's some really interesting questions, and maybe technology in the future would allow us to do some of this, if not all. So the question arises, what would happen in that particular instance? So you've got body A, who is now clearly dead, de-brained, and body B, who has a new brain. Okay? So there are two inquiries here. Okay? The first inquiry is, the body A from which the brain was removed, would this body still contain the soul? And clearly not. The body's dead. The soul would go. And it would now become disembodied. The inquiry two is, the de-brained new body B, if it was to be transplanted with our brain, would our soul then migrate to this new body? If so, would this body be alive or dead? That's an interesting question. And it's a question that needs addressing. So on that basis, let's say we say no, it would not migrate. It would not migrate. Where is the soul then? Is it disembodied? And then we come into the issue or philosophical issue of monism and dualism. So monism would suggest that basically the brain is just a sense of reduced matter, and that's about it. And there is certain ways the brain works that allows us to perceive ourselves in a subjective manner. Dualism suggests that no, there's something more to it than that. There is a consciousness, and that consciousness can be a substance in itself. And so there's a dichotomy of the body and the soul, or body and another substance which controls the body. So the next is, yes, it would migrate, okay? And in that case, the body B would be alive, and it would be us, okay? Or a different us, maybe. So this falls into the idea of monism, property dualism, substance dualism, which I don't have the time to go into more detail, but generally speaking, it falls on the idea of the problem of personal identity, okay? So there are a number of different areas within this. So problems of bodily resurrection fall onto there's the idea of corporal monism and property and substance dualism. So very, very briefly, substance dualism is basically where you are looking at the concept of the mind as being a separate entity and the body being a separate entity, or the material aspects of the brain, if you want to put it that way, as being a different entity in itself. And they have to interact with each other. Okay? And the idea of property dualism is that it's all about matter. But what actually happened is when matter came together and all this exchange was happening in the brain, there was an adverse effect. And the adverse effect of this was a quite positive adverse effect, which was basically our consciousness. So it's very materialistic understanding. So we come to the substance dualism, which basically suggests that dependence on our body is contingent and it's not necessary. So then there's the issue of metaphysical personal identity, and I'll just skip right down to, there's two concepts that need to be dealt with for anybody who's interested in this, and that's the binding problem. The binding problem is, how do these ideas get integrated and united as one so that we perceive ourselves in a subjective manner as I. Okay? And the explanatory gap is, what's our theory and explanation of how the material and the reduced element of the brain, or the functional part of the body, interacts and has a cause and effect relationship with the soul, or the soul with the body, in that respect. So the Quran basically gives us sort of implicit information, but it makes some very important statements, which says that we will revive these bones when they are decayed. So he who created them the first time will revive them again. So Kant's objection to this would be that the dualist is unable to account for the possibility that the soul or immaterial self is constantly being replaced by different individual selves. So what you are now to what you are now are two different people. Your experience of what I've told you in this time that you walked into this room to what you are now suggests that you have two different personalities now, because you have different sense of knowledge, a different imagination. I've told you something, given you some information about the soul. Maybe you perceive the world quite differently, but you already see, is that you? So there's a question of Kant's objection in terms of the personal identity view. Now, going back to the theologians, Baqilani, he says the soul is inherited by these accidents. So clearly, these accidents, in terms of our knowledge and our capacity and various other things, are accidents that inhere in the atoms of ourselves. Imam al-Ghazali talks in his Tahafut and his Iqtisad, but basically what he does is, he's very interesting because Imam al-Ghazali struggles with this a bit. That's the reality of it. And he struggles from this 2 points of view. One is in terms of trying to give him a theological explanation, but yet approaching from a reason and rational perspective. And at the same time having the political dimension of the Asharis on his back, because Imam al-Ghazali was an Ashari. So for that reason, he first highlights that Ibn Sina is wrong. Ibn Sina basically says that the soul is mortal, okay, and it's immaterial. So Imam al-Ghazali then refutes that the soul is immortal. And the whole subject of this is the issue of resurrection. So Ibn Sina says that the body, when it comes from the personal identity perspective, it doesn't make sense. There's no rationality in this. So for that reason, when the body is resurrected, on that basis, it would make no rational sense for it to do that. So for that reason, he says it's immaterial, and it's basically, he talks about it being immortal, but yet that there is no bodily resurrection, in other words. Imam Ghazali refutes that, and he says there is a bodily resurrection. Okay, and Imam Ghazali talks about it, the fact that the bodily resurrection may be that God will produce an exact like of your body, al-mithl of you. And in essence, what you would be doing is you would be moving from what your body was to a new body, which is just like you. And that comes back to the point of the fact that in 20 years' time, could you say that your body is exactly the same as it was 20 years ago? Clearly, over time, your atoms have become parts of other people's atoms. Yeah. So then we come to a long debate about contemporary philosophical theories such as constitution theory. Brute force is very similar to the idea that was in the verse of the Quran, that God could do that. He could, especially if you believe in the idea of occasionalism, then God could just create you, just like a miracle, and that can happen, no problem. The interesting thing here is that, which I noted, and I've not read this anyways, it's my own political perspective to this. Why is it that the angel has to come and blow the soul into the fetus? And why is it that the angel has to come to withdraw the soul? Cannot the soul do it on its own? So what is it that the angel's doing? So there's clearly some metaphysical issues around that particular point. So there's clearly some problems. Many of our integrative functions, according to the challenge, are not mediated by the brain, okay, and therefore persist in individuals. So Schumann basically and Potts, they make a very important statement. They say, look, why should the brain be important? There are other integrated functions, such as issues around homeostasis, assimilation of nutrients, growth, and various other things, which are clearly not do not bring the brain into the forecourt. So on that basis, brain is more an enhancer rather than an integrator. So, for example, locked-in syndrome. Locked-in syndrome is basically a lesion of the brainstem. So these individuals are actually conscious, so their cerebrum is actually working. So they're very aware of their environment, but they have absolutely no control over their body in any form or manner. The only thing they can do is move their eyes. Now, those kind of individuals, they are clearly brainstem dead. So would they now be considered as dead? So you have already an issue with the idea of the brain being the integrated component to this, especially when you're looking at it from the brainstem perspective. So the higher brain approach therefore goes, then we must look at an essence. What's the essence here? And that's where the discussion lies. And the essence is a consciousness, the alertness, the awareness. That's the essence of who we are. And that's the important thing. So what controls the essence? So we fall into another thought experiment again. And it's important. These thought experiments are very important because if you look at classical jurists, what they did was, and there was a big debate about this, they used hypothetical situations to elaborate on their concepts and their understanding. So, you know, it's a favoured behaviour. But anyway, we look at the thought experiment about a fetus prior to emergence of mind. Is it alive? Yes, it is. It is alive, but a lower valued life until it is ensouled. So we're already putting a moral status before ensoulment and after ensoulment. Then we look at the idea of patient in PVS. So this is for somebody's in a vegetative state, spontaneously breathing, circulating blood, exhibiting a full range of brainstem reflexes. Is that individual alive? And the answer to that is no. No different, because the PVS patient, his brain, his cerebrum is completely dead. So he has no concept of consciousness. So he's not aware whatsoever, but yet his bodily is perfused with this artificial means. So no different to a fetus, and hence a lower sense of life. So that would be equivalent to a fetus in that respect. And if you look at it in Catholic infants, for example, these are infants who have no, in very lay terms, have no brain. Okay? And they're born without cerebral hemispheres, but they have a brainstem which allows them to breathe spontaneously. Okay? And they usually die within a few days. There's hardly any. I think there was one instance somebody died for a year, and that was probably the only recorded incidents. But generally speaking, they're born without cerebral hemispheres, and they never have capacity for consciousness. Are they alive? That would be the same as the vegetative state individual. That they would not be alive, or they would be alive but at a different moral level. So the conclusion is that you can accept one of the two ontological concepts for soul's departure. One is the organism, which comes into existence at conception or shortly thereafter and dies when organismic functioning radically breaks down. So the body dies, in other words. So that's the soul departs when the body dies. That's problematic, and I've already explained why that's problematic. The second is the minded being who comes into existence when sentience emerges, and might, in the event of a vegetative patient or a permanent coma, and that person dies about before the organism dies. So the soul departs when the minded person dies. Now that's the interesting point to raise here. Now I talk very quickly, if I have a few minutes. Yeah? How can we determine that it has occurred? So remember the second point that we're looking at, how has it occurred? So this is a very epistemological sort of point of view. So how can we determine that it has occurred? So this is a very interesting way of looking at it, but generally speaking, if I was to say to you, I have the technology and the ability to now replace any part of your body, so artificially that is. So for example, if your limb was to be replaced, would your soul leave? No. If your kidneys were replaced, would your soul leave? No. If your lungs would be replaced? No. Similarly, your heart. So heart, a lot of people emphasize the traditional views about lungs and heart. But if I took your heart and replaced it with an artificial means, your soul would still be there, and we'd be very certain about that. Your spinal cord, it would still be there. The reticulospinal tracts are basically those tracts that deal with the control of the lower body. Okay? So if I was to basically take away that and replace it with artificial means, the soul would still be there. Okay? The ascending reticular activating system is that switch in the brainstem which basically puts your consciousness on and off. But consciousness can't be described just solely on a very simple basis. It's quite complex because you have the issue of alertness. So somebody's just alert. Okay, alertness is just awake. And there is an awareness as well, where somebody's very perceptive to their environment. So consciousness is a big spectrum. So that is the lowest end. So that's just soul alertness. So you have individuals who may have a lesion of their reticular activating system, and they may be completely brain dead, and yet their body is functional in that respect. So they have spontaneous breathing, but they're completely brain dead. There's nothing there. There's no conscious alertness, conscious wakefulness, but there is alertness in the way that their body is functioning. Then you have, so if you were to replace the ascending reticular activating system, that is that little switch, would that soul leave if you were to replace it? Or would the soul still be there? That's an interesting question. Cerebellum is the posterior part of your brain, and what that does is it controls your balance, your functioning in terms of the muscle tone and balance, and various other actions related to the motor area of your body. If that was taken away, the soul would still be there. That person hasn't died. Then that should actually be the occipital lobe, not the posterior lobe. But the occipital lobe basically is to do with your vision. So if we were to replace that, the soul would still be there. So we're looking now, going right down to the finer details of the brain. Then we come to the frontal parietal lobe, and this is to do with your cognition, the area of your cognition. So this is about how you engage cognitively with the world. If we were to replace that, would your soul be there? Would it leave? That's the interesting question. So the materialists will say, of course it would, because you've taken that little aspect of the brain out, which clearly is aware of its environment. But what would the Islamic understanding of this be? Would the soul actually leave because it would be rendered useless? It has no ability to think using the body, so for that reason would it be useless? And then you have the whole cerebrum. If you take the whole brain out, the higher part of the brain out, would the soul go, or would it be there, would it not be there? Remember, you've just replaced it. So these are some very interesting questions that need to be addressed. But the issue of certainty is very important. Islam, and I talked about the normative ethics of Islam and how practically we can engage with all this, is on the basis of the Sharia and the certainty component. So there are many maxims that some of the Muslim scholars recently have used in the debate about organ transplantation and brain death and so forth. So al-yaqeen la yazulu bi-shak, so basically certainty is not eliminated through doubt, and the maxim al-aslu biqa man kana ala man kana. So basically the maxim, the original state remains on that what it is, what it was. So clearly the person was alive, so we need some serious evidence to now claim that they are dead, in other words. So these are maxims that are used on that basis. But the reality is, but yaqeen here refers to ghalat al-dhann. It's impossible for it to be yaqeen in the sense that it's absolute. It has to be on the predominant conjecture, which falls on that 75%, which I talked about earlier on. I haven't deliberately put more slides in this area. There are more slides on the issue of certainty and so forth, but I think that suffices. So, but the scholars use many, many examples of its use in this particular way. So they talk about the collusion in the intended murder. I'm not going to go into the detail, but I'll give you one example. Fetal abortion between 40 to 120 days. That's an issue of ijtihad. Okay, it's a reasoning of ijtihad, whether it's 40 days or 120 days. The Quran is not explicit about it. So on that basis, if you believe it's 40 days, and yet somebody says it's 120 days before it's installed, and then they have that window period to actually abort, are you not taking somebody's life? And if you are taking somebody's life, you're doing it on the basis of ghalat al-dhann then. So, it really plays into the whole formula quite extensively. So the definition of death is a moral issue on that basis. So irreversible loss of the capacity for consciousness marks the time at which it is appropriate to commence death behaviors, in other words, because we talked about life being of different types. So death is seen at two levels for that reason. Real death, or maut al-haqiqi, is a higher brain death, allows for some rulings of death, such as withdrawing life support. So that is real death. And then the second level is the legal death, which is a maut al-hukmi. Now, these are words that I've made up myself. These are some of the discussions that have happened in some of the resolution committees of ulama. and they've described it as mawt al-haqiqi, mawt al-hukmi. What I've done is I've elaborated it in much more deeper sense, engaged it with science and also with philosophy and kalam. So you see the higher brain death with cessation of all important functions allows for remaining rulings such as burial, distribution of wealth, their inheritance and so forth. So reality is that there are certain sentiments about this, aren't there? There are arguments against this approach. Okay, there's one about discussions about its determination are often prompted by a moral or pragmatic agenda, such as, is it truly death, moral death in itself, or is it for external reasons? So are we doing this solely because we want to transplant organs? Is that the reason why we have a sense of morality when it comes to one level of moral death and another level of moral death? So, but it should be intrinsic morality, if it's to be called death. So that's the first issue. And even if it is, then why should we follow the higher brain standard in preference to the other standards in that respect? And then the second two, which is a recurring argument about a person with relatively conservative instincts may say that death behaviours are morally appropriate only when the whole brain or cardiopulmonary standard has been met the traditional way. So we need to ask, therefore, what grounds exist for this claim. And the response to that is, the first one, conscious life is a precondition for virtually everything what we value. And the whole concept is taklif, the fact that we are obligated to perform and do certain things. If we have no control over our body in any sense or manner, then that soul is redundant. It has no role whatsoever, and that seems quite problematic. The second point, number two, is to do with the traditional concept of death. If you look at it from a few views, it's problematic in suggesting that the difference between human life and death comes down to the state of two organs, the heart and lungs. Why should we give them fundamental essence when clearly there are other organs that are more important when it comes to the integrated functioning of the body? And they can be easily replaced. So heart and lung can be artificially replaced. The traditional approach overemphasizes our biological nature, suggesting that we are nothing more than organisms, makes the whole concept of death occurring at time of soul departing a completely redundant concept. It's all about the fact that your body is perfused. It's not about your soul or anything else. Reality is that's what it's resorted to. And then the thing is that this will also lead to serious issues because we can keep somebody on a ventilator yet they have no perception of the world whatsoever for quite a considerable amount of time, and that will have issues on resources and various other things. And not only that, but it'd be a very difficult thing for families to deal with. The third and the last one is a person will still be alive if, so for example, if I was to tie somebody up to an artificial support machine and then behead that individual, then if I follow the traditional way, then I would say that that person is still alive. Yeah? So there are some problems with that sort of definition. Death is actually a process. It's not an event or a point. Okay? So on that basis, we have what we call the sakarat al-maut, which is the pains of death and the phase that you go through before you die. Then there seems to be a kind of a space of time where death is occurring, and in that time maybe departure of soul is occurring, or the higher brain standard, the whole brain standard, whichever you should follow. Then you come to a very late stage, which is rigor mortis, petrification. So if you look at it from that perspective, now this is quite an interesting slide, because what this does is it tells you what point should you therefore decide that somebody has now died. So if I was to give you a whole journey of death, you have, for example, the brainstem death. So what happens is you've now recognized that this person is brainstem dead. You do clinical tests and you recognize that. So there will be now a cascade of events that are going on. So this person will now have a cardiopulmonary death. Then they'll have a whole brain death. So there will be a whole process of things that will happen. And then there will be a whole body death at the final end. Now, if we bring that down, so if you look at the idea of brain death test being confirmed, the whole brain death being confirmed, the traditional death test being confirmed, if you look at it from the cellular level, you have what we call cellular death cascade. So the cellular level death cascade will initiate. And then you'll have cellular death type 1, type 2. These are apoptosis, various processes that a cell goes through before it dies. So at what point do you say that this individual is dead? Do you do it at the beginning of the cascade, where this person is inevitably now going to die? It's irreversible. So it's irreversible. Or do you use the concept of loss of capacity for life? So irreversibility can be a very problematic word to use on that basis, because even if you look at cellular level death type 2, there are certain substrates that science has discovered that you can use, and you can actually reverse some of the process. In fact, they've even discovered, and there's quite a bit of detail behind this, that even cells, when they die, they actually rejuvenate in some instances as well. So it's an interesting idea. So using ideas of irreversibility could be very problematic. So the loss of capacity for life would be the main thing here. And the idea is, once you realize there's a trajectory to death, at this point, that will suffice for you to then make a decision that this is now death in itself, and there is loss of capacity for life now. So the accuracy of brain tests, so for example, if inconclusive with clinical tests, we can use EEGs, and EEGs are quite effective and very sensitive and specific. 90% of the time they will detect brain death. And because of its availability, easily available, very practical, okay? And it's the preferred confirmatory test for brain death. There's no accurate anatomical criteria defined for higher brain death, though. So that's the issue with higher brain death. So what do? We measure consciousness, subjective, first-person experience, clinical evaluation is sort of limited to evaluating patients' responsiveness to the environment. How do we do that? How do we assess that? So the cautionary step would be to go back and be on the cautious end and go to remain on the idea of brainstem death. So as a conclusion, we come to the idea that the boundary between life and death is not perfectly sharp. Perhaps death is no more determinate than adulthood. So you would say that he has now reached a certain age where he can smoke. Or this is an individual who has now reached a certain age where he can drive. So what you do is you give a kind of a moral standard to different stages. Or must persuade us, and this seems like a real interesting conversation to have when you say grandmother is partly dead, but less dead than grandfather, although he's not fully dead. So, already you can see there's some complications with this whole idea. But the main thing is, it's about public acceptance. And when public can accept that clearly brain death is dead, then, that is a piece of work in itself. And then it will have impacts on other issues such as criminal law, how they would treat death, and on the basis of punishment for death. So I'll finish on that note. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry I've gone quite considerably over time.
Thank you.
So, thank you.